This week on the LIVEcast, we discussed finding the way of peace through the culture wars.
Hey, welcome to the LIVEcast. My name's Glenn Scrivener.
And my name's Paul Feasy.
And we're going to think about culture wars today. Paul, why are we thinking about culture wars?
Well, I mean, because some of the big things that have been going on. Well, I say big things. There are things that have been going on.
Yeah.
Some of them in the news. So two things that have particularly been kind of brought head to head with each other have been an incident around a cricketer, Ollie Robinson, who has kind of been has he been suspended from the team
from international cricket, and then he himself has stepped back from all cricket.
Yeah, basically for tweets he made sort of 9 years ago that have come to light, and so he has been kind of cancelled, so to speak. And that has kind of come up in the news at a similar time to some articles around Shamima Begum, who some of us might know as a teenager who, when she was 15, went off to Turkey and then ended up smuggled into Syria, where she joined IS. She became a kind of child bride there. And there's been issues there since then about her returning to the country. Her citizenship has been taken away. And the real thing that's come up with these two has been, well, do we forgive these people?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we forgive Ollie? Do we forgive Shamima?
Yeah, and the way that people answer those questions and the people towards whom they kind of lean tends to sort of also map onto people's political leanings a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
And so people more to the right tend to want to forgive Ollie, and people more to the left tend to want to forgive Shamima. Massive generalization, but
yeah, of course, yeah.
But there it is. We'll be talking about that kind of culture war, but also in the news, Maya Forstater was in the news because she won her appeal against a tribunal decision that's a couple of years old now that said that her view that sex is immutable and biologically based, back in 2019, they said that was verboten and beyond the pale, and was not a view that should be held in modern society. And she has had her appeal to that claim upheld. And again, people's reactions to that tends to fall along some fairly well-worn culture war kind of lines. And then also over the weekend there was a woke Christianity conference that I did not attend, but Twitter was a little bit bubbling with some of the things that were said on there, and I thought that one tweet in particular, one comment in particular, really revealed the dividing line in so many of these culture wars. And I guess we're talking about the culture wars because I think Jesus is our way through the culture wars. He was born into a culture war. When you think of the disciples that he had around him, on the one hand he's got tax collector Matthew, and he's got Simon the Zealot.
Yep.
One guy is stealing from his own people to get rich from Rome. The other guy is firebombing,
Romans.
the Romans, soldiers, and yet in Jesus' community, he's able to draw both. And the way in which Jesus handled that culture war was, it was to love his enemies. And here's a radical way through the culture war. Is there a way through today in the 21st century? We kind of think so. But there was one other thing that happened in the news over the weekend that we think kind of cuts through the culture wars and cuts through the struggle between people. What was that on Saturday?
Yeah, so Saturday, kind of late afternoon, early evening, as part of the Euro 2020s, Denmark and Finland were playing, and about 40 minutes into the first half, the Danish player Christian Eriksen collapsed on the field, having suffered from a cardiac arrest, and had to be resuscitated. And obviously was taken to football. He was taken to hospital, and the match was suspended at that point.
Right. Should we have a look at what happened?
Yeah,
let's have a look.
Goodness, he's gone down there, Eriksen. That's worrying, disturbing. Oh my dear. This is really worrying. Anthony Taylor's reaction was immediate. Welfare of the player, paramount. Anything else is meaningless and deeply disturbing. And we're all praying for him. It's quite stunning. We're looking forward to a competition, and suddenly something much more important is at stake right now. Just wondering if this is his wife now. Dear, oh dear.
So absolutely sickening to see Christian Eriksen just sort of go down, and he'd been playing the game. It was about half time, just near close to half time.
5 minutes left to play, I think, of the first half.
So he'd been playing absolutely fine for the first 40 minutes, and then just like that.
Yeah, no warning. I was saying to you earlier, like occasionally we've seen this thing happen on the pitch before, and some players have appeared kind of unwell and then have kind of gone down. But as you can see on the clip there, I mean, he's absolutely fine until moments before, and then just he's on the ground, and seemingly, at that moment he's stopped breathing, and obviously they're there doing CPR and stuff. Very quickly.
And these incidents really draw people together. You had the Danish fans and the Finnish fans saying, one side was saying Christian, the other saying Eriksen, and sort of.
Yeah, and there's nothing more tribal, really, is there, in our society than football? And the amazing thing is that in the midst of all that, like all that suddenly goes out the window.
Right. As
they see these people there, as you see someone on the ground who's literally, fighting for his life.
Right.
And you've got medics in there who are giving of themselves, to try and revive this man.
Right.
It put things in perspective for people, doesn't it?
Yeah. As one of the commentators said, everything else is meaningless. Like
even football.
Yeah. Even
you
football.
Can imagine such a thing
is meaningless in the face of death. And I mean, there was some criticism of the BBC for showing this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it. I mean, Christian Eriksen was trending on Twitter, and the BBC was trending on Twitter, and people were saying it's absolutely disgusting that they've shown images of this man being resuscitated. Want to have a bit of respect for him and some bit of dignity, and his wife on the touchline there. I mean, you saw on the video there being consoled by the teammates, and some people were saying they've clearly violated well, Ofcom and human decency is what they were saying. But even as I kind of, as even as I read those things, like in a moment we'll read a tweet that I saw that someone had posted about it. Even before I read this tweet, though, I thought there's something powerful about showing
it's
that.
Confronting,
yeah. And the reason people don't like seeing it is because it puts something that's very real in front of our eyes that we don't see very often. And we've talked a number of times about, when we did Reset, we had John Bear on, and he just says we don't really see death. And obviously, Christian Eriksen hasn't died. He's pulled through. He's seemingly going to be okay, although they're saying he may not play professionally again. But of course, there is a moment there when they're giving him CPR, they use the defibrillator on him, defibrillator. At that point, you are clinically dead, basically.
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure clinically dead, brain dead, I don't know, but how it works. But your heart has stopped.
Yeah.
You can't use the
Paul is not a medical professional, people.
Yeah, please don't take medical advice from me.
If you're collapsed, maybe try everyone else in the room first.
But for all intents and purposes,
yeah,
your heart has stopped. You have died on the pitch.
Wow. Wow.
And that's not something we see.
Yeah.
We don't see death.
Right.
But then I saw this tweet, which... it just, as I was just scanning down, and it only had like 1 or 2 comments on it, didn't have any retweets or things, only about 4 likes and stuff. But someone said this. They said, much about TV coverage of Christian Eriksen's crisis, meaning there's much being posted about it. I've thought much about it. On balance, I think it was right to show the situation as it unfolded. Let me explain. 1. We witnessed the fantastic medical team working hard to save his life. We saw the value of early defib and CPR. If you don't have any idea what to do, find out now. I need a refresher. 2. We saw the true face of footballers, ordinary humans with emotions, friendships and feelings. So easy to overlook this amidst the razzmatazz. 3. We saw the value of teamwork, both by the medics and the players, sharing the situation, helping. We saw Mrs. Eriksen being cared for by, effectively, his workmates. 4. So many people watch medical fiction on TV. They watch programs about heinous crimes or horror, yet when real life is presented, they hide away or avert their eyes. An odd paradox. 5. Many have claimed that the coverage should have stopped to protect Christians' dignity or sensibilities, but many of those suggesting this are probably those who would cowardly avoid helping others in distress, seeking to protect their own sensibilities. 6, we can all marvel at the good news that he's awake now, but we can all learn that when a fellow being is in need, it's up to us to do something about it if we're there. Learn first aid now. Best wishes, Christian Eriksen. The world's rooting for you. You know, and I thought, you know, as I read that, you know, I thought, actually, I think there's a lot of truth in that actually it is good for us to be... There's a lot of good that this person has pointed out that what we've seen there in... I mean, I'll be the first person to admit, you know, I think about... I don't really follow football. I watch international football. I don't care week by week about local teams. And I'll often think about footballers and just think, you know, here's a bunch of, like, overpaid pretty boys, you know, maybe not that bright, you know, and just... you know,
you snob.
You can kick a ball. You know, just kick it in that goal hole over there. All right.
So in the jocks versus nerds debate, which side do you lean towards?
You know,
Paul.
So, but you know, you can see those guys there, and they're a guy. You know, someone said, I don't know if it was one of the commentators, or at least on one of the bits of footage, said, you know, so and so there appears to be praying. You know, and those, you know, you can see his teammates obviously very affected. And it's right, you do see them as people in those moments.
Yeah.
And of course, we did see all the great work of the medical team doing stuff and coming together. We saw the consoling of someone, you know, his wife has kind of come down from the stands. And clearly kind of in bits. And, you know, you've got the captain of the team, I think it was, and is it Kasper Schmeichel? Is it Kasper Schmeichel? I'm not sure.
The keeper.
The keeper was there as well, consoling her.
Brad Hansen says, the video put our fragile humanity on display. I don't think our world wants to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that so many people were like, as this tweet said, you know, you'll turn on the telly and we'll all watch medical dramas or just TV programs with killing and death and all kinds of things in it without thinking about it. And, you know, when we talked about this earlier, you said, that's escapism, you know.
Right.
But what we don't want is to see the reality.
Right.
And, of course, the reality, though, is it was there on the pitch on Saturday, and it was the reality for Christian Eriksen. But what makes us comfortable is that we kind of know it's the reality for us as well.
Right.
Like that can happen. That life just can be taken away. Right. I mean, we've kind of talked about that in the last year, haven't we, with the pandemic? But even then, that's been... It never looks quite so dramatic, does it?
Yeah.
You know, you don't just drop down straight away.
Right.
Whereas that, in a moment, he's on the floor. And the whole thing turned around.
I once had this happened to me on the cricket pitch. Like my cricket captain, I think he was 40 years old, which at the time, like, I thought this guy's the oldest man alive. You know, I must have been 22 at the time, and he bowled the ball and it was struck back at him and it hit him directly over the heart, and they reckon it might have stopped his heart momentarily.
Wow.
And he dropped to the floor, and his eyelids sort of go back, and he starts fluttering, and he didn't kind of come to for another like 3 minutes or something. It was a really, really kind of hairy time. And then the next like week, when I saw like the ambulance came, and he sort of, you know, came together, and they told him he was lucky to be alive, and afterwards he said to me, you know, it really makes you rethink your priorities, and I've decided to divorce my wife and quit my job and travel around the world and act like an 18-year-old.
Wow.
And what was fascinating is that, like, I was identified as Charlie Church. You know, I was the Christian on the team, and he took me to one side, and he was like, yeah, I've decided to reevaluate my life. And I was like, I was about to invite him to church. And
yeah, great.
So I'm going to divorce my wife.
Wait, what? Sorry?
Wait, what? So, you know, these incidents, they do make people think about life and their priorities, but they might not always make the decisions we wish.
No. I did make me laugh, though, on the Twitter feed of that. Obviously, here's this great little tweet, you know, saying, isn't it great that we saw these people and so on. And there were 2 responses to that tweet. One said, this might be the best post I've ever read. Right. And the other one just said, who asked for your opinion? Which I thought that just sums up Twitter perfectly right there. Like, we're back to the tribalism again.
Back to the tribalism. So what will cut through? Well, maybe death will cut through. Maybe our mortality will cut through. Maybe it won't. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is Genesis chapter 14, which I preached on a couple of weeks ago, and I think I'll preach on it again because like a girl came forward at the end of my evening preach of it, a couple of weeks ago, and wanted to give her life to Jesus. And it's like,
brilliant.
Well, and it's not the passage that you would ordinarily think of as your go-to evangelistic text.
Not so much, no.
And if Genesis 14 is not ringing any bells for you, we've created a little explainer video, and you can get the gist of Genesis 14 in a couple of minutes. So let's watch that. In Genesis 14, we learn how to engage the culture wars. Here we are in the ancient Near East, about 2000 BC. We've got the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Salt Sea, aka the Dead Sea. So we've got the Med, the Red, and the Dead. Up here would be modern-day Turkey, modern-day Iraq, modern-day Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and here is the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land promised to Abram. Now, in Genesis 14, we have the first mention of kings, as well as the first mention of wars. That is no accident. Kings make war. So there are the kings of Shinar, Elasa, Elam, and Goyim. They form an alliance against the 5 kings, the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. So it's 4 kings versus 5 kings. And this is not goodies versus baddies. We've learnt in Genesis 13 that the people of Sodom were sinning greatly. They are no better than the 4 kings. It's not goodies versus baddies, it's just power versus power. And to begin with, the 4 kings rule over the 5 kings, but then the 5 kings rebel. The 4 kings come down to fight, and there are a bunch of battles listed in Genesis 14, but the upshot is that the 4 kings win and capture the plunder and the people from these 5 cities, including Lot. Lot is Abram's relative who had gotten caught up with Sodom and caught up in the wars. Lot is very different to Abram. Lot was seduced by the city of Sodom. Abram is different. He's described as a Hebrew, which means one from beyond. Abram is not a king of a city, even though he had a large household. He lives by the promises of God alone. He lives in tents. In Genesis 12, we read about how he comes up out of Egypt with great plunder. In Genesis 13, we read about how he spies out the land. That's an eye there. Now, in Genesis 14, he makes conquest of the land. That's a sword. And of course, Abram is prefiguring Israel, which would come up out of Egypt, spy out the land, and then make conquest, which in turn prefigures Christ's life, who came up out of his escape to Egypt, wandered the land, and made conquest through peacemaking atonement at the cross. So Abram's story is Israel's, is Christ's, and it's ours by faith in Christ. So we can now look at how Abram handled the wars of his day, because that will teach us about our own culture wars. So that's Genesis 14 and the culture wars. And I think the reason why that can apply to us is that, you know, the Abram story is recapitulated. Big fancy. There's a $2 word. It's gone over again and strengthened by the Israel story, which takes up the, out of Egypt and spy out the land and make conquest. And then Christ himself fulfills that, and he comes up out of Egypt and wanders the land and makes peace through his death on the cross. And now we in Christ are now children of Abraham, and therefore we are to live according to the same pattern. And what is the pattern of Abram? Abram is a weirdo because he is a Hebrew, he's from beyond, he doesn't engage in the culture wars. He's not interested in whether the 5 kings are more right than the 4 kings, actually. And the 4 kings are the northern kingdom, the 5 kings are the southern kingdom, and the one thing we know is from the previous chapter that the people of Sodom were sinning greatly. So it's not like they're the goodies. It's just power versus power. It's just because Lot happens to get caught up in Sodom that he even, is drawn into this war. And I think lesson number 1 about how to deal with the culture wars is stay out of them. Like, do the Abraham thing. He's not interested in building a city. He's not interested in being a king, even though he's got a massive household. He probably has, 2,000-3,000 people in it if he can raise up an army of 318. But he's not interested in empire building. He's not interested in power. He stays out of the culture wars and mainly focuses on building up the household of faith. And as we bring that into the 21st century and we think about the culture wars, I think, lesson number 1, stay out of them. Yeah. If you can.
Just think about that idea of, you go back to some of the I don't want to keep harping on about this because we talked about this in so many ways, like the bash stuff about getting your people into positions of power.
Yes.
And I just wonder how that puts that in perspective.
Yes. Yeah. If your strategy is basically to influence the king of Sodom so that he could be a more Abrahamic kind of a ruler, like, not so much. And it's not about trying to affect the 4 kings or the 5 kings, nor is it just Abram is going to be an individual all by himself and just crying liberty and freedom. He is going to build a community. It's just that the community that he's building is a household of faith built on the promises of the Lord, rather than a kind of an earthly kingdom, a tower building exercise like Babel. And I think so much of why we get caught up in conflict is because, first of all, we're seeking power, and we're seeking influence, and we're seeking a seat at the table. And what does Abram spend his time doing? He spends his time building up the household of faith, because he's got a promise from the Lord that his community will be as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore.
Yep.
And I just wonder, what's the lesson for the church if we're largely, involved in the household of faith? There will come times when we're called to choose between the 4 kings and the 5 kings.
Yeah.
And what Abram does is he does go to bat for the 5 kings against the 4 kings. But interestingly, at the very end of Genesis 14, he doesn't want to take any money from Sodom. He's like, once the plunder comes in, he's like, I don't want a penny of it. I'm not interested. It's all going to Melchizedek anyway, he says, It's all going to the priest of God Most High, Jesus, basically, and therefore, I think people are going to sort of call me a quietist, or the Benedict option or whatever it is, retreat, people. Let's
Yeah.
But it's clear that Abram's long-term goal is to build a household of faith.
So how does that? I mean, I guess there are questions there, like you say, about there will be times when you're forced to choose between the 4 or the 5. There are. I mean, I think generally it seems like sound advice that we shouldn't be involved in the culture wars, or we ought to, in some way, transcend the discussion. But there may be times. It's knowing, I suppose, when there are times to step in, forcefully, and then. I just think back to, we were talking about John Stott a few weeks ago, wasn't he? He was saying, like, if you look around a society and you think, like, society's all gone to pot, like, actually that it's the church's fault because we've not been salty enough,
Right.
And I'm just wondering whether there's any, like, how does that tie up? Like, what does it mean to build up the household of faith then?
Yeah.
In today's context, what would that look like? I don't know.
I think that gels with Brad Hansen's question here. Interesting parallels regarding Abram, but to add one more variable, there's another king in the narrative, Melchizedek. Where does he stand in this? Melchizedek at the end of Genesis 14, he is the king of Salem, which is short for Jerusalem. So, we got the king of Jerusalem. Salem also means peace, so he's the king of peace. His name means king of righteousness. He brings out bread and wine. He calls himself priest of God Most High, and he does all the blessing. So, he's Jesus, right? And the great goal in all of this is to bring things back to Jesus, to bring Lot, to rescue him. And even to say to Sodom, he says to the king of Sodom, look, I don't want you to make me rich at all. I'm giving it all to Jesus, essentially. And I think a community of faith that centers itself on Jesus, his way of peace, his way of cheek-turning love, his way of surprising strength through weakness. He only goes into battle with 318 men. It's a very surprising, counterintuitive kind of a victory. What does it mean? I chatted to a guy at the end of my sermon, and he's from Hong Kong, and he said, he said, I had no idea that Genesis 14 would be so relevant to my experience of being in Hong Kong, caught between pro-democracy people on the one side and the Chinese Communist Party on the other side. And there is a very large Christian element to the pro-democracy fight. And, at times in those protests, they sing hymns and Christian hymns. because the church has taught them a different way to be, and not simply to be dutiful citizens of the Communist Party. Actually, because they've got a different Lord called Jesus, it makes them think differently about politics. And at times, they want to stand against the Chinese Communist Party. And I think, there would definitely be points where you would side with the pro-democracy movement versus the CCP. But as me and this Hong Kong friend were talking about, there is definitely a danger of being more pro-democracy than you are Christian.
Sure. Yeah.
And for that to simply be thought of as a different political persuasion rather than a spiritual conviction. So.
Couple of good comments coming in here. Wendy Lomont says, "Is there a difference between getting involved in the culture war and just politics?"
Mm-hmm. Just politics? Or just politics?
Simply politics.
Yeah, there is such a thing as justice, and it has a bearing on society, and we'll see that in one of our examples of how people conceive of the culture wars. Is the justice that Jesus brings simply for the individual sinner, or is there a society-wide implication for the gospel? And I would say, yeah, there is. And this is one more way that we transcend the culture wars. In a sense, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a real watershed moment in history, in which, up until that moment, Christians had kind of seen slavery as an evil, but it was like poverty. What are you going to do? Absolute destitution it's evil, it's terrible, it's lamentable, but it'll be with us until Jesus returns. And let's just get on with the gospel, people, right?
Right, yeah.
And what you had, with Quakers and certain evangelicals and others was this conviction that the freedom that Christ has won for us in the realm of the church needs to be extended to the society-wide. And they fought for abolition. And it was a culture war, and they took a side, and they took the side of justice and justice for the whole of society. But I think from that moment onwards, you can never wholly be quietistic, I don't think. Because I think the Quakers and the evangelicals at that stage, they kind of carried the day, and they were like, well, justice ought to have real-world consequences, and it ought to get rid of slavery. And anytime someone wants to make a quietistic argument, people say, oh, then you would have been quiet during the transatlantic slave trade, wouldn't you? So there's got to be a point where you enter into the fray, as Abram does. When you enter in and how you enter in is a matter of wisdom.
Trickier, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Joy Turner said, "I don't think you'd advocate the church or people of God holding a neutral position on sin in society, however." Forgive me if I hideously misrepresent your position. Very thought-provoking as usual. She said, "Having a state church makes it tricky not to be smack in the middle of culture discussions."
Yeah. We're not neutral on positions of sin in society at all, and we should be able to call out the northern kingdoms, those superpowers, and we should be able to call out the sins of Sodom as well. And I think our first priority is to call out the sins of our own people. Like the first person you point the finger at is Lot. Like, Lot, what are you doing?
Right,
being seduced by the power of Sodom. And then maybe you even call out the sins of Sodom, even though they're on the side that you fight for. And then you point the finger at the rest of the world. But this is not to condone the evils that go on in society. It's not whether you engage them, it's how. And what's interesting is, as Abram trains up 318 men, they're clearly handy, And Abram, I don't know how you picture Abram, but I'm always just picturing a very, very old man,
bearded old man,
right?
Basically.
Who could be tossed like straw to the wind, probably, and yet he's a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah,
and there ought to be ways in which the church is raising. My prayer for our kids is that they will make their mark in society, because the Psalms talk about, and Proverbs talk about, kids being like quivers, like arrows in your quiver. And it's the idea that they're meant to be shot out into the world and make their mark. But they're meant to do it in a different kind of a way. 318 kind of evokes what happened in Judges, where Gideon took on the Midianites, and there were too many of them, and so they had to whittle it down to 300. And so, yeah, the way in which you engage is meant to be a strength and weakness kind of a way, a surprising Jesus-y kind of a thing. But when they do engage, we're meant to make our mark. These are all sort of vague and abstract kind of notions, and one of the tricky things is how do you apply it, and especially how do you apply it when talking to my Hong Kong friend. One of them thinks you're being too much just politically pro-democracy and not enough Jesus-y, and the other person says no, but you're the other person's just being too quietistic, and it's just me and Jesus, and I'm not. And the real problem is these are wisdom issues about when to fight and when not to fight, how to engage and not. And Christians get divided over them, which is a real complication. And it kind of brings us into the area of this first example of how the culture wars are kind of like spoken of in the church. And there was a conference held over the weekend about woke Christianity and the gospel. And it was just interesting that Darrell Harrison made a comment on Twitter. In fact, he made a comment on his in his talk, which was then quoted on Twitter. And I think here is where some of the culture wars, where the rubber hits the road within Christian conversations. Darrell Harrison said, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. He did not come into the world to save society. So you've got different visions going on there. And it made me kind of draw up this little table. And if you're listening on the podcast and can't see, I've got an image that's got left on the left and right on the right. And basically, and if you're from America, you'll think, why has he put left in red and right in blue? Because Democrats are blue and Republicans are red. But, well, in this country, Labour is red and Conservatives are right. But on the left of this diagram, basically, the point is all of our culture wars are, in Tom Holland's phrase, sublimated Christianity. It's basically
in English, please.
In English, please. So it's basically it's a Christian debate by another name.
Sure.
These are intra-Christian disputes, actually, but where we've forgotten the Bible references. We're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references. And on the left, people are more into the grace part of Christianity, and on the right, people are more into the law side of Christianity. Jesus kind of holds both together. You walk away from Jesus, and there tends to be some lean more towards law, some lean more towards grace. On the left, you tend to think about society more and the kind of society you want to see, and you think in terms of collective. And on the right, you think in terms of individual and bring things back to the rights of the individual. And again, like in Jesus, those two things kind of are very much together. Walk away from Jesus and they get pulled apart. On the left, you tend to talk more about equality, and on the right, you tend to talk more about liberty, about your sort of personal freedoms. And so that's kind of what's going on when Darrell Harrison says, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. He did not come into the world to save society. Which seems, and then that sort of set off a little Twitter war, as these things tend to do.
It's a strange dichotomy, isn't it, in some ways? I mean, because what is society if not made up of sinners?
Yes.
You know?
Right.
And it is when you begin to wonder how much people's theology is geared just around their politics.
Yes.
More than anything else.
Right. Mr. Green on Top Chat has just said, here in the US, there's very little to none of grace on either side of that dichotomy. Yeah. And what we'll see is that the grace of Jesus is very different to whatever grace, is supposedly espoused by either side. Because everyone is lenient to their own side. If someone's on your team, then you give them a free pass. And we tend and we call that grace. Whereas what does Jesus do? He says, love your enemies.
Yeah.
Love the person on the other side. And this is the way through the culture war. You know, Jesus navigated a way through a culture war, and he just said, love the enemy. So Christians should thrive. Paul van der Klee is saying this all the time. Christians should thrive in a culture war because Jesus was born into a culture war and he showed us the way. Love your enemy, which we don't tend to do. But
what could be more distinctive than that?
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
It came up a few weeks ago on something else we were talking about, didn't we? That is the key distinctive.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
So everybody loves the people who love them.
Yeah.
And people who are like them.
Right.
What reward is there in that? What have you gained?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And this is how you know that it's not from left or from right, but from above. Supernatural, transcendent forgiveness. And so what would it look like to both think that Jesus came to save sinners and he came to save the world? Because come on, the world is a system. Like John 3:16, Jesus came to, God sent. What's John 3:16 again? God so loved the world. God, yeah, that's right.
I do know it.
It's in the New Testament section of your Bibles, and God so loved the world, and the world is a system that's allied against God, and yet God loves that system, right? So he's loving his enemy, but he's seeking to save the world, and he wants us to disciple the nations. It's so interesting. Jesus doesn't say go into all nations or make disciples from all individuals among the nations. He says, disciple the nations.
Yeah.
There's massive corporate language in the Bible. Overwhelmingly. Just think about Adam and Christ. We're corporately in Adam or we're corporately in Christ. And it just seems to me that what's happened is in Jesus, there's this society that's called the church. And I find my individual specific giftingness in the context of the church. I'm a member of a body, right? And I might be a little toe and you might be a left ear. And we find our particularity in the society that is called church. But you step away from church and you either go towards the state on the left or you go towards the individual on the right. And the society and the individual are both really, really important. But I think they make sense in Christ and in his church. But Brandon John Kemeny says, I'm conservative but struggle. The seemingly impossible road, the state taking responsibility for so much, to individuals taking responsibility that doesn't lead to a lot of pain in the interim. Now, it is so true that the state has grown to a size that would be inconceivable maybe even 100 years ago. Talk to someone 100 years ago and you tell them, here is all that the state does and here's the budget and here's your level of tax. And they'd be like, you're joking, aren't you? And has there been a sense in the last 100 years of we're like kind of frogs in the pot, just getting boiling and boiling and boiling and there is ever more of the state. But, so I think that's true, and I think that is an absolutely right analysis. And if you're looking with biblical goggles on, the state in Revelation language is not particularly positively kind of put.
Right, yeah.
Kind of beastly, But then what you get is, on the other sides, you get the libertarians and the right wing saying, therefore, it's all about the individual, it's all about the individual, it's all about the individual. Which, again, with biblical goggles on, it's hard to get that straight out of the Bible.
Yeah.
I think you can see how Christianity invented the individual. Larry Seidentop's written a brilliant book called Inventing the Individual, and he says, look, before the advent of Christianity, families were everything. And you're a cog in the wheel of your family, and the family is the unit. But suddenly, with Christianity, you start, and it's a long process. Christianity worked its way into first the Roman Empire and then through Christendom. We started to be less, families, tribes, clans, empires, and we started to become an association of individuals with individual rights and liberties before the law. That's a really long process. But there are very few proof texts that you sort of go to in the Bible that says Paul isn't, an atomistic individual.
Yep.
All the impetus, a lot of the impetus now for individualism is coming from Enlightenment kind of thinking that's developed absolutely out of the roots of the Christian gospel, but it has at times gotten divorced from the scriptures, and so the individualism that comes out can be unhealthy, just as the statism can be unhealthy as well. So let's just go back to these images. So you've got, on the left and on the right, when you come away from Jesus, you come away from the law and then grace dynamic, and those on the right tend to go towards law and order, and those on the left tend to go towards kindness, I guess. On the left, you tend to think in terms of society. On the right, you tend to think in terms of the individual. On the left, you tend to think in terms of equality. On the right, you tend to think in terms of liberty. And that means as we come to our second issue of the culture wars and things that have been happening in the last week, there's been the Maya Forstater tribunal decision. When did Maya Forstater first come onto your radar screen, Paul?
Well, I think I'd heard about. I think the initial kind of controversy was about 2019, wasn't it? And I think I was aware of it then, particularly because was it at the same time that J.K. Rowling actually referenced her, because she was the person that
I stand with Maya was the hashtag.
Right. Yeah. So. But I suppose I hadn't really thought about it for a long time, because obviously here we are in 2021, we're kind of 2 years down the road. There's been a little bit going on in the last year as well. It's just taken my mind off things. So it's only really in the last week or so that this has come back onto my radar.
Yeah. So she had a contract that was not renewed because she'd made some social media claims about men being men and women being women being women largely. And, she believes that sex is immutable and not to be conflated with gender identity. And at the initial tribunal, the judge said that her approach was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And therefore, of course, she could be discriminated against because this view is beyond the pale, which is kind of scary to say that, I
think a man might be a man.
Yeah.
And a woman might be a woman. That's
right.
Hate speech.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
That is a bit crazy, isn't it?
Not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And so at this original tribunal, Mrs. Forstater was described as an absolutist, and she caused an enormous amount of pain that can. She fostered an enormous pain that could be caused by misgendering. So this decision was overruled in the last week, and so plenty of people who are making the case for individual rights and the freedom to be able to speak your mind and say what you think. It was a victory for such people, and I guess those kinds of people kind of lean right, and at that stage, what's interesting is that at that stage, Maya Forstater I don't think is a Christian, but for her feminist convictions and because she believes in the freedom of speech, and she is celebrating that victory, and a lot of people are celebrating that victory, and a lot of Christians are celebrating that victory because, of course, in the Bible, gender is a thing. It's kind of a big thing.
Yeah.
And so, but it's just really interesting. I've got my Genesis 14 goggles on, and I'm seeing, and I like, is this the cause for us to get the 318 fighting men and engage the battle? And maybe it is. And what's interesting is that some Christians will say, yeah, this is the hill to die on, because it's reality. Like if people say men are women, it's like saying 2 + 2 = 5. And all of reality has gone out the door. And so some Christians are like, let's gather the 318 men, let's fight against the kings of the north. And other Christians are like, come on, guys, this is not a gospel issue. This is about gender. It's not about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get into fights about whether it's right. But what as Mr. Green has said on YouTube, is there a freedom of conscience ultimately? And it is certainly very wise for Christians to be on the side of wanting freedom of conscience, because we want to be able to say what we think about Jesus, without being cancelled. But then, at the end of the day, the apostles got cancelled, Yeah. And the epistles are not full of the Apostle Paul saying, petition Nero to see if we can have freedom of speech on this issue.
They're saying, isn't it outrageous that we've been arrested for saying this?
Right.
Let's form a...
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to get a petition going in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That we can then get signed, take to the authorities. And
Yeah.
You never see that, do you?
Instead, they rejoice that they are counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Which is interesting. So I don't think you should ever poo-poo anyone who wants to go into bat for freedom of conscience issues and freedom of religion issues and freedom of speech issues. And we mustn't divide over people who think, this is the issue on which we need to engage. But I do think if there are some Abrahamites who are just hanging around the trees of Mamre and building a force, I think they kind of show the way. I do think they show the way. If they're just underneath the oak trees in Mamre, just kind of with a bit of shade, kicking back, enjoying a sangria or something, at that stage we're just like, oh no, you're cowards. Okay, you're cowards. I get it. If they are fostering the family of faith and raising up a small army that can, in the way of peace, take on the superpowers of the day, then that is worthy of respect. But it is not always the right thing to go into the fray because, of course, Maya Forstater is correct, because she is. Right?
Well, I agree. Yeah, I think she's correct. Yeah, and I think what you said earlier is that the difficulty with so many of these things is it is a wisdom thing. Yes. Just where do you draw the line? Yeah. And unfortunately, because we do draw the line in different places, what it often becomes, rather than being fruitful in many ways, it just becomes a division between those in the church, which then just causes arguments in the church. Yes. I mean, even just having a conference called Woke Christianity. Yes. I mean, basically all you're doing there is friendly fire, aren't you? Right. Right. I mean, all you're doing is slinging mud at another group of Christians, surely. Right. I mean, I'm wrong. Yep. I didn't go to the conference. I've not heard anything apart from what you've told me about it, but it seems to very much just be pointing at those guys over there who call themselves Christians. Right. But we're the chosen remnant. Right. And it's not like that could ever go wrong, is it? It's not like we've seen that in recent weeks of things we've talked about.
And we've said it before, it can happen in a country in which maybe 40% in your city go to church on a Sunday. And so in your vision, the real bad guys are the church down the road. Whereas, if you've got 2% of your town going to church on a Sunday, which is true of so many cities in the UK, you're probably not going to take on the church down the road.
Not so much
with the same alacrity. Let's get on to the third example of culture war in the last couple of weeks. So there was an England bowler. This is cricket, people. Cricket. If you don't understand cricket, I'm very sorry for you. But Ollie Robinson made his debut for England at the age, I think, of 28. And he had a very good match, took 7 wickets and scored 40-odd runs. And yet it was all overshadowed by people having dug up some old tweets of his that he tweeted out when he was 18. And they were definitely unsavory, racist, Islamophobic, sexist, all that kind of stuff. And he eventually had people like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, coming out to bat for him and sort of saying, well, it's been a long time in the past and, he's learned his lessons and it was 8 or 9 years ago. But what also happened is that in the same week that those old tweets had come up and most people were making, it seems, reasonable argument that there might be a thing called redemption.
Yeah.
There might be you might not be sunk entirely by your misdeeds in the past. Perhaps there is such a thing as atonement. But in the news cycle, also Shamima Begum was being spoken about because there's a documentary out about her experience and the other two of her friends who went from East London to Syria to join ISIS. And the UK government has said they've revoked her citizenship. She can't come back to the UK. She's in Syria. All three of the children that she had over there have died. In infancy. And there is sympathy out there for Shamima Begum because she was a teenager. And so on Twitter, what do you get? You get, well, if Ollie Robinson is a teenager and he can be forgiven for his misdeeds when he was a teenager, then what about Shamima Begum?
Yep.
Because she was a teenager and she made a mistake, and why don't we forgive her? It must be racism. It must be because she's a minority or something like that.
Yep.
What do you make of the comparison?
I think you've got to recognise a difference of degree between what has been said, haven't you? You know, Ollie Robinson, the things you said were offensive and they were wrong.
Yeah.
And he seemingly there is a level of repentance. But even if there wasn't, you know, is it the same to say, you know, make some crude, crass jokes on Twitter as joining a terrorist organization who have routinely been, you know, murdering people for
raping and,
raping, you know, in often horrific ways. I think you'd find it hard to say that that's equivalent. I'm just, you know, I'm treading carefully there.
Is it okay to say? Yeah, no, definitely. But here's another issue in the culture war is you know, whether words and violence are the same. And again, our Christian inheritance has kind of said, no, that the only sword that is justified in the Christian realm is the sword of the Spirit, i.e. the Word of God. And we've got a very strong notion of the words are one thing and actions are a very different thing. I think walking away from Jesus, people are starting to say, you know, words of violence.
Yeah, sure.
Which I think will not end well for society. But what about, I mean, back in the chat, Christoph Keating said, I tend to want to forgive both, but some caution is needed with people who are involved in terrorist activities. And I think Christoph there he's taking the kind of the third way.
Yeah.
And it's actual forgiveness. Because I think actually people on the right who want to say, oh, Ollie, he's earned his way back into society and he's kept his nose clean, they kind of, is that forgiveness or is that giving a free pass to someone because they worked hard? And then on the left, if those want to be merciful towards Shamima Begum, very often that's not according to the law, but according to grace in terms of, well, she is an ethnic minority. And she's had a hard life. And she's a victim in so many different ways. And for that reason, we give her a free pass. So it's just interesting. On the right, you get a free pass because you've worked hard and you've put it behind you because of your good deeds.
Yep.
On the left, you give someone a free pass because they're a victim and they're a minority. And both ideas are quite Christian, like in many ways.
Yeah.
You know. and the idea on the left is quite Christian, but still, that's not forgiveness. Because so often what we do is we just try to find excuses for people's behavior and justifications for it. And we try and balance the scales, which is not forgiveness. You know, what true forgiveness would be is to say, that is inexcusable, therefore I forgive you.
Yeah, however.
And Christoph is saying, look, I tend to want to forgive both. I think that is the Christian way, but as he notes, forgiveness does not mean that there are not consequences.
Sure.
In terms of national security and
wisdom.
Yeah.
There's wisdom to be. You know, you probably, you know, now Ollie Robinson has said what he said in response to it. You know, he's been very apologetic and things. You're probably not looking. You know, they're probably not looking at him with great concern.
Yes.
If you came back on your cricket team, you probably wouldn't be. You might watch his Twitter feed a little bit, maybe. If you know, if you were still a bit uncertain. But there's no need to think, well, we should strip him of his citizenship or anything like that. You know,
Yeah,
you wouldn't
yeah.
go to that level. But you can see there is still wisdom even in being cautious around.
Yeah.
You know, in the same. Oh, I don't know if I want to say in the same way, but there are people in. You can see there are people in church settings who maybe have past convictions for all kinds of things.
Oh yeah.
And we would say, you know what, we want you to be part of our church. We believe Jesus loves you. We love you.
Yeah.
But it is still right for us to be cautious.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got someone who
You're not
going to
run the
done
Sunday
for
school.
fraud and stealing,
Right. Yeah.
you might not get them counting the money.
Right.
You know, being the treasurer.
Right.
You know, that's just wisdom. You know.
Yes.
Perhaps, and hopefully the person would say that's probably quite wise as well. Like, knowing. My temptations or something, but
yeah, exactly. But I think outside of Jesus, people tend to go for either law or grace. You know, and I think there's a third use of the law. You know, there is a way that you can use the law even for a Christian, and there are all sorts of regulations that you should abide by, even if you've forgiven someone entirely. Christoph Keating says, "No, Twitter crimes are the worst crimes in the world." Which he does clarify. He says, if you believe Twitter mobs, at least. Yeah. But I think one of the lessons for me is that Twitter is not real life. And one of the only reasons why Shamima Begum and Ollie Robinson were being compared is because they were both in people's feeds, because the news cycle kind of threw up both stories, and they both happened to be trending topics. And then somebody goes, I know, they're exactly the same. And this confirms everything I've always thought. You know?
I can imagine Ollie Robinson just watching this unfold, thinking like, how on earth did it go from this to being compared to someone who joined a terrorist organization?
Death cult. Yeah. And it's because people think Twitter is real life, and Twitter is not real. Twitter is definitely a realm in which you should probably sit under the oaks of Mamre.
Yes.
And watch the Four Kings versus the Five from a safe distance. I think so weighing in on Twitter spats might not be the best use of your 318 trained men. Just saying. But
no.
And Brad Hansen says, trust but verify. In terms of reconciliation with people and bringing them back after sin, trust but verify sounds wise. And you know, trust is unconditional. Oh, sorry, love is unconditional. Trust is not unconditional, right? Love is unconditional. Trust is earned. Trust is earned, and you know, and whether you trust a sex offender with the Sunday school. I would say that's very unwise.
Sure.
And there are pathways to reconciliation. But there it is. It's as we promised you. It's Maya Forstater, Ollie Robinson, and Melchizedek, and bringing them all together. So let's not go to war over which culture battles we engage. But let's always be aware that the big job, I think, is building the family of faith, founded on the promises of God, and raising a family of faith that can engage at times with society, but engage in a very countercultural way. So, Paul, how can people keep in touch with us?
Yeah, follow us on social media, so Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok as well. And of course, you can always get our emails by going to speaklife.org.uk/sign up, and we'll send you a nice little roundup of things that are going on.
Brilliant. And on Saturday, we're going to be releasing our Father's Day video once we've made it. We're very timely here at Speak Life, but Father's Day in the UK is on Sunday, and so we'll film our Father's Day video at some point this week. So keep your eyes peeled for that on YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok, and give us a like and a subscribe, and you'll get that in your feed. But thanks so much for joining us on the LIVEcast.
Always good to have you. Take care.